Welcome back for the afternoon session. If you've all looked at your programs, you'll see that one person who is supposed to be on this discussion, the lunch discussion, is not sitting up here, and that is Senator Dick Durbin. And he is unable to be with us today because he is off doing the business of human rights. So we have to applaud him for that. The Senate is voting today on whether or not to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, a human rights treaty that's already been ratified by 125 countries. It's an important human rights treaty that would help ensure that people with disabilities everywhere are treated with dignity and enabled to reach their full potential. But there's opposition in Congress to this, and some of it is just because it's an international agreement. But fortunately, there is a broad coalition of supporters that includes veterans and disability rights groups, as well as President George H.W. Bush and former Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. And it also includes Senator Durbin, one of Congress's great champions of human rights, who helped lead the effort to ratify the treaty and who wanted to be there today to see it through. So we excuse him and wish him well. Senator Durbin understands that when the U.S. refuses to join other countries in advancing human rights, it hurts our country's credibility and our ability to lead on all issues. So we applaud his leadership and we await eagerly the outcome of the vote today. Speaking of American leadership on human rights, it's my privilege to introduce Aryeh Neier, who's going to talk about Rodger Baldwin. The medal that we'll bestow today bears his name. The Rodger Baldwin Medal of Liberty was established in 1989 in honor of the principal founder of the ACLU and the International League for Human Rights. Well, it was actually called the International League for the Rights of Man back then, but we all got enlightened. We share the privilege of presenting that award with the ACLU. In odd number years, they honor an individual for outstanding work protecting civil liberties in the United States, and in even-numbered years, we present the award to an individual or organization for outstanding work protecting human rights outside the United States. So this year, it's our turn. Not only did Aryeh personally know Rodger Baldwin, as a former national director of the ACLU and founding executive director of Human Rights Watch, Aryeh is a giant in both of these overlapping worlds. His career is too rich and his accomplishments are too varied to summarize them here, but if you're looking for a capsule description of his extraordinary life, you could do no better than this. Aryeh fled Nazi Germany with his family in 1939 and 38 years later famously defended the right of neo-Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois. That principled position generated a lot of controversy both inside and outside the ACLU, but Aryeh is no stranger to controversy. Throughout his career, he's been fearless in standing up for civil liberties and human rights in the face of often heated opposition. His latest book, published earlier this year, is a history of the human rights movement. If it occasionally reads like a memoir, that's because Aryeh has played a role in so many important developments. He was just telling me before lunch that he accidentally found himself in Cairo the day that protests broke out in Tahrir Square. There are multiple stories like that if you want to read them in his book. That book, which I read, is not a triumphalist account. It discusses not only our movement's successes, but also its failures and its current challenges, and it's laced with Aryeh's trademark honesty. Please welcome Aryeh Neier.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I was immensely pleased when Elisa and Human Rights First asked me to serve on the jury that chooses the recipient of the Rodger Baldwin Award. I was pleased because I have particularly admired the work that Human Rights First has done, especially under Elisa's leadership of the organization. I think it has been some of the outstanding work that has been done, both with respect to domestic civil liberties and with respect to international human rights. I was also pleased because there are so many brave persons at great risk to themselves and often paying severe penalties, who defend human rights internationally, and the opportunity to recognize that work was something to be treasured. And the third reason that I was pleased to serve on the jury is that the award is named for Rodger Baldwin. And as Elisa indicated, I had an opportunity to work with Rodger. More than a half century separated me in age from Rodger, but Rodger lived to be 97 and was vigorous intellectually and physically right up to the end. And so for a little more than the last 2 decades of his life, I had an opportunity to collaborate with him. Rodger is best known for his role in founding the American Civil Liberties Union and serving as its executive director for the first 30 years of the ACLU. Actually, his work in international human rights goes back to about the same point as his founding of the ACLU. That is, as a young man, he changed later, but as a young man he was a bit of a leftist and certainly supported the Russian Revolution. And yet in the early 1920s, he published a book for which he wrote the introduction, and a book that he edited entitled Letters from Russian Prisons. And it was really one of the first accounts of the human rights abuses that were taking place in what was then known as Soviet Russia. During his tenure at the ACLU, Rodger periodically took time to travel internationally and sought out persons like Nehru in India and Sun Yat-sen in China to try to get them involved in the civil liberties and human rights cause, and indeed did persuade Nehru to become a founder of what was then called the Indian Civil Liberties Union. After World War II, General Douglas MacArthur, as the leader of the United States occupation of Japan, invited Rodger to Japan to talk about civil liberties there, and a consequence of that was the formation of a Japanese civil liberties union. In the closing days of World War II, Rodger founded what became known as the International League for Human Rights. I first encountered Rodger, or got to know Rodger, in 1960, when he was then the oldest member of an American delegation to a human rights conference concerned with Latin America that took place in Venezuela, where a democratic government had just succeeded a military dictatorship. And I was the youngest member of the delegation. I was 23 years old and got to know Rodger at that time. And then later on, 10 years later, when I became the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union, Rodger was my predecessor, twice removed, but he was still international advisor to the ACLU. And so I was able to have many long lunches with him and extract from him some of the history of the civil liberties movement in the United States and the human rights movement in the United States. In a way, and I'm not sure this is widely recognized, Human Rights First is itself a legacy of Rodger Baldwin. because Human Rights First started out as the Lawyers Committee for International Human Rights, and that was initially to be an offshoot of the International League for Human Rights, which Rodger had founded. And so there is a wonderful symmetry about having Human Rights First be the organization that presents the Rodger Baldwin Award for International Human Rights. Having been a member of the jury that presented the award, I was delighted to participate in the choice of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. I think Rodger would have been very pleased to have an award in his name presented to the Bahrain Center. In the past nearly 2 years in which the struggle has been going on in Bahrain, the leaders of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights have been the principal source of information for the world that is on what is taking place in Bahrain, and they have done this at immense personal cost. Jailings, imprisonment actually for very long terms, beatings, torture, everything. And yet, undeterred, the organization continues to struggle for human rights in Bahrain today. It is just the sort of work that Rodger always wanted to support. He himself spent a year in prison during World War I, although probably under rather better circumstances than the current leaders of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. Rodger was a conscientious objector during World War I, and actually one day got locked out of prison. He was gardening outside the prison, and they forgot to tell him when they locked the prison for the night, and he had to make noises at the gate to get himself readmitted to the prison. So things were a little more comfortable for him than for his counterparts in the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. At any rate, I'm going to call on Bill Zabel, the chairman of Human Rights First, to talk about Human Rights First's work with the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and actually to present the medal. I do want to say also, with respect to Bill, that when you've been around as long as I have, you get to know and get to work with a lot of people, and I don't recall exactly when I first met Bill, but I knew him first as a volunteer lawyer for the ACLU, and I believe it was in the 1960s. Bill's volunteer work for the ACLU was very distinguished. Among other things, he played a leading role on behalf of the ACLU, which represented the married couple in Virginia named Loving, in the case of Loving versus Virginia, that overturned the prohibition on interracial marriage. So Bill Zabel has his own very distinguished career as an advocate of civil liberties and human rights, and I'm very pleased to turn over the lectern to Bill.
Thank you, Aryeh, for being here. I'm very flattered to be on the same platform with Aryeh, because he actually is a legend in our field. I'm reading his current book, which I urge you to read, as did Elisa, The International Human Rights Movement in History. But he's written 7 books. I may be one of the few individuals who's read almost all of them, and they're all very good, and I commend you to read them. He has been a great leader of human rights almost in every respect, including leading the Open Society foundation to be, without a doubt, the leading American foundation promoting human rights. He and I do go back a long time. I'm pleased to hear Rodger Baldwin lived to be 97, because I hope it's some precedent for both of us. We started together, as Aryeh correctly recalled, in the 1960s when he was executive director of the ACLU and I was a volunteer lawyer. One of our first cases that he assigned to me was a peculiar case because it was an obscenity case, and the only obscenity was the title of the magazine, which I won't detail for you, but that was my initiation into the civil liberties realm. And then, of course, I had a very exciting time in Mississippi in '65 and '66. But I want to talk today not about my career. I'm only a legend in my own mind. Aryeh is a real legend. Human Rights First has been working in Bahrain since the beginning of the uprising, and we were involved there because we thought we could have a significant impact. We, as an organization, try to foster American leadership on human rights around the globe, and we want to focus on countries where human rights problems are strong, but the United States has a strong relationship there. We think we do. It hasn't proven to our satisfaction yet in Bahrain because of it being a U.S. ally and the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet being stationed there. We recently, one of our board of directors, Rear Admiral John Hudson, and went with Elisa to Bahrain and talked to Vice Admiral Miller, the commander of the Fifth Fleet, and met with various senior officials in the Bahraini government, as well as activists and teachers and lawyers and doctors, and many of whom had been arrested and tortured by the regime. They came back convinced that we could be helpful to the United States and Human Rights First to do more to push reform there, because it still needs a great deal to be done. We had the privilege of working with the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. When I asked Brian Dooley of our organization for a short description of our work with this outstanding organization, he said, quote, we've been with them in court hearings, lobbied with them in D.C. and Geneva, gotten tear-gassed with them, went with them to visit injured prisoners and protesters and families of people who were tortured to death. We tried to give them a measure of protection as they do their courageous work. In a way, this award is hopefully also a measure of protection, or at least recognition of the great work of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. It was founded by Aryeh Al Khawaja, the father of our honoree, who is now serving a life sentence in prison for his activism, and who himself was tortured and beaten and is recovering medically from some of that. His daughter, Maryam, who's followed in her father's footsteps, was born in Denmark because her parents were exiled from Bahrain, and she and her family were not allowed back in the country until she was 14. After attending Brown University on a Fulbright, she returned to Bahrain in the hopes of finding a job or teaching or public relations, but the regime blocked her employment rights, and so she entered the family business. Her family business is fighting for human rights, and it's a noble business, which she's great at. She is now the center's vice president and head of its foreign relations office. She helped lead the protests early in the uprising before embarking on a speaking tour in the United States and Europe to generate support for democracy. Because she's likely to be arrested if she returns to Bahrain, she has remained abroad at 25. 25, you have a long way to go to 97. She's become the public face of Bahrain's pro-democracy movement. As you'll see in a moment, despite the hardships her family has endured, she is undeterred. Whether testifying before Congress or imploring the United States to take a tougher stand, she's a passionate and persuasive advocate for human rights in Bahrain. Please join me in welcoming Maryam to receive this award.
it's a bit heavy, so I'm going to put it back in the case. Of course, I would like to start with thanking Human Rights First for choosing the Bahrain Center for Human Rights for the work that they've been doing. And of course, the president of Human Rights First, who has taken it upon herself to actually go all the way to Bahrain just to see for herself what was happening on the ground, and then to write an article about it, which was published in the Washington Post. I don't think, as honored as I am to be here today, I don't think that I should be up here. Because the real heroes of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights are in Bahrain today. And they're working in the shadows. And they're the people, they're the silent heroes who nobody knows about, but are actually doing all the work. I'm sitting in safety in Europe. And as many threats as I get, I know that I'm safer than the people who are on the ground. The Bahrain Center for Human Rights was never an organization that had a fancy office, or a huge billboard outside that people could come and visit. And it was never a place where people worked because they needed a salary. The Bahrain Center for Human Rights was built on volunteer work. Everything that we've achieved was because there were people who took it upon themselves to say, I want to see a better Bahrain. Not because I'm being paid for it, but because I will take time out from my family, from the things that I want to do, to build a better Bahrain. Now, the Bahrain Center for Human Rights was closed down many years ago, and it continued to work regardless, without an office. People would meet in people's homes. People donated money from their own work to keep the center running. And despite many, many, many attempts and campaigns by the Bahraini regime to try and close down the center or stop our work, they have not been successful. And they continue to try. They use defamation campaigns. We've had board members and colleagues who have been put in prison, tortured, mistreated. The defamation campaigns have been ongoing for years. So it's not just something that started with the revolution. This is something that goes way beyond that. Our co-founder today sits in prison with 4 fractures in his face because he's a human rights defender. And my colleagues who should have been on the stage with me today, they cannot be known, because if they are, in Bahrain today, if you are a human rights defender, and if you are someone who works for a better human rights situation in Bahrain, your place is prison. And that is the problem. Now, why is it that the situation in Bahrain today continues? Since the 14th of February 2011, the protests in Bahrain have not stopped. We just stopped hearing about them. And it's because the Bahraini regime believes that they have international immunity. And the problem isn't in their belief that they have international immunity. The problem is that they are right about the fact that they have international immunity. Where we saw special sessions and different steps taken to hold certain governments accountable for human rights violations, nothing was done about Bahrain. Because Bahrain is a strategic ally. And this is where the question lies. How long are we going to allow double standards to decide where populations should be able to achieve human rights and democracy and where they should not? In the Gulf today, and I also work as the deputy director of the Gulf Center for Human Rights. In the Gulf today, when you come out and you decide to be a human rights defender, you're not just putting your life on the line. You're not just putting your livelihood on the line, the lives of your family and your colleagues. You know that you are on your own, because where other human rights defenders will receive international support, if you are from the Gulf, you are on your own. If you go to prison, you are on your own. If you are tortured, you are on your own. And so when you go out and decide to be a human rights defender in the Gulf today, you know that you will not receive international support. And this, again, is part of the problem. We need to move past, we're in the 21st century, and I had hoped, I watched my father work in the human rights field my entire childhood. And I had hoped that by the time I grew up, maybe I wouldn't even have to be in the human rights field. But I had hoped that the day would come when your value as a human being and your rights are not based on the passport that you carry, but because you're a human being. But unfortunately, we have not reached that today. Your value as a human being, whether you're in the United Nations or other places, is based on the passport you carry. And as a Bahraini, my value as a human being and my human rights are not worth the barrel of oil that comes from Saudi Arabia, unfortunately. Now, I want to end with this. I know my talk is usually very depressing and very pessimistic, so I'll end with a very positive note. When the Bahrain regime decided to beat unconscious the co-founder of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights in front of his family and drag him to prison where they continued to torture him in the hospital, and when they decided to arrest Nabil Rajab, the president of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and sentence him to 3 years imprisonment, and when they decided to stop Sayyid Youssef, my other colleague, at a checkpoint and beat him in front of his 2 little daughters, and the list goes on and on, they thought that they can stop the work of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. What they don't realize is something very simple. There's an idea that's floating around these days. It's a very beautiful idea. You can imprison the revolutionary, but you cannot imprison the revolution. You can imprison the human rights defender, but you are only creating a path for hundreds of new human rights defenders. And that is what we will continue to do. Thank you very much.